Nobody noticed the waitress until the room began to fall apart. The words would have sounded dramatic if anyone had said them out loud, but in the private dining room of the Blackstone Hotel, they were simply true. Emma Carter moved quietly between the polished tables, balancing a silver tray with steady hands while rich men in tailored suits talked over her, as if she were part of the furniture. She had learned long ago that in a room full of powerful people, the safest thing a woman like her could do was become invisible. That was exactly what she had been doing tonight, until she made the mistake of looking up. At the far end of the room sat Damian Blackwood, the man every whisper in the city seemed to orbit. He was the kind of man people lowered their voices for without even realizing it. A mafia boss with a cold expression, an expensive watch, and eyes that seemed to measure the weight of everyone's soul. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking much. He was simply watching, as if the entire room existed to entertain the possibility of his judgment. Emma had heard his name before, of course. Everyone had. But hearing about a man and standing 10 feet away from him were two very different things. Standing near Damian Blackwood felt like standing next to a storm that had already decided where it would strike. Emma did her best to keep her head down. She had bills to pay, a mother depending on her from across town, and exactly zero interest in being noticed by someone like him. Men like Damian did not see waitresses. They saw service, compliance, background noise. And tonight, that suited Emma just fine. She moved from table to table, refilling glasses, setting down plates, offering polite smiles that never reached too close to the truth. Her uniform was simple, her hair pulled back neatly, her shoes already aching from the hours on the floor. Nothing about her suggested danger. Nothing about her suggested importance. Which was why no one noticed when she paused beside the service station and caught sight of something odd. A man at Damian's table slipping a small folded note beneath a napkin. It happened so quickly that anyone else would have missed it. But Emma had spent years noticing little things. The panic in a customer's voice before they left without paying. The trembling hands of a man lying about his order. The subtle change in posture when someone felt watched. So when the stranger's fingers trembled just slightly, and Damian's gaze narrowed for half a second, Emma felt her stomach tighten. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Before she could make sense of it, one of the suited men barked at her to move faster, and the moment was gone. Emma lowered her eyes, picked up an empty glass, and kept walking. Still, that tiny slip of tension followed her like a shadow. Because in a room like this, nothing happened by accident. And if Damian Blackwood was about to be betrayed, then Emma Carter, the waitress nobody saw, had just become the only person in the room who might notice before it was too late. Emma tried to push the strange feeling from her mind, but the moment had already planted itself deep inside her thoughts. She kept moving through the dining room with practiced calm, yet every sound now seemed sharpened. The clink of glassware, the low murmur of expensive cologne and old money, the faint scrape of a chair on marble. Damian Blackwood had returned to his conversation as if nothing unusual had happened, but Emma could see the difference in him now. His shoulders were still, his jaw tighter than before, and his eyes no longer drifted lazily across the room. He was focused, watching, waiting. That alone was enough to make the air feel colder. The private dinner had the look of an ordinary business gathering, but Emma knew better than to trust appearances. Men with money rarely needed a room this secure unless they had something to hide. Men like Damian never gathered this many people unless power was being measured, traded, or threatened. She moved to the sideboard and adjusted a stack of linen napkins, pretending not to listen while her ears caught fragments of conversation. One man spoke too quickly. Another laughed too loudly. A third lowered his voice and leaned in close enough to make Emma's skin crawl. She didn't need to hear every word to know the mood had changed. There was tension beneath the polished surface, something sharp and dangerous humming under the silence. Then she noticed the man sitting 2 seats away from Damian. He was broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, and dressed too neatly to look suspicious at first glance. But he wasn't eating. He wasn't drinking. His right hand stayed under the edge of the table, hidden from view. Emma froze for half a second when she saw the cuff of his sleeve shift and a glint of metal flash beneath it. A concealed weapon. Her breath caught. She looked at Damian immediately, expecting him to notice, expecting the room full of armed men to react. But no one did. Or if they did, they were pretending not to. Emma's pulse quickened. She had no business knowing what these men were involved in, and no power to intervene even if she did. But walking away now felt impossible. Something in the room was dangerously off balance, like the first crack in a dam before the flood. She moved toward the dessert table to give herself a reason to stay near the center of the room, and that was when the stranger with the hidden weapon glanced at her. The look lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Not irritation, not suspicion, recognition. Emma's stomach dropped. He knew she had seen something. She forced herself to keep her face blank, set down a plate of untouched pastries, and turned away before anyone could read the fear behind her eyes. But her mind was racing now, pulling every detail apart and reassembling it into something far more dangerous. The note, the trembling fingers, the hidden gun, the two smooth smiles at the table. This was not a dinner. This was a setup. And somehow, in a room full of men who could order death with a phone call, Emma Carter had just become a problem. By the time Emma realized how serious it was, the room had already begun to tighten around her like a trap. She stood near the dessert table with her hands steady and her expression carefully blank, but inside, her thoughts were moving too fast to catch. The man with the concealed weapon had looked at her. That 1 second of recognition had changed everything. It meant she was no longer invisible. It meant someone in that room now knew she had seen what she was not supposed to see. And in a place ruled by men like Damian Blackwood, being noticed was often more dangerous than being ignored. Across the room, Damian remained seated, his posture controlled, his face unreadable. Yet Emma could feel the tension radiating from him now in a way she hadn't before. It wasn't fear. Damian didn't seem like the kind of man who feared much of anything. What he carried was something sharper, something heavier, awareness. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know exactly where the danger was coming from. That realization sent a strange chill through Emma, because if a man like Damian was already on edge, then the situation was much worse than she had imagined. She reached for a stack of plates to give herself something to do, but her attention stayed locked on the table. The man with the gray at his temples leaned in to speak to Damian, and when he smiled, the expression never reached his eyes. Emma saw another detail then, one that made her pulse thud painfully against her ribs. The man's left thumb kept tapping twice against the rim of his glass, a deliberate, controlled motion. It was not the nervous habit of a guest. It was a signal, a coded one. Emma didn't know how she knew that, only that every instinct in her body screamed it was true. A waiter passed behind her and nearly bumped into her shoulder. She stepped aside automatically, but the movement gave her a clearer line of sight toward the far end of the room. That was when she noticed two of the security men stationed near the doorway exchange a look. Not the quick glance of colleagues, but the charged, uneasy stare of men waiting for a signal. Emma's mouth went dry. The setup was larger than one hidden gun, larger than one suspicious guest. This had been coordinated, planned. She was standing inside the center of something that could collapse in seconds. Then a sharp vibration pulsed through her apron pocket. Emma froze. For one terrifying moment, she forgot to breathe. She pulled out the small phone she used for work schedules and saw a message from an unknown number. There were no words, only 4 digits and a symbol she didn't recognize. Her eyes lifted slowly from the screen to the table across the room. The man with the hidden weapon was still staring at her. This was no accident. Emma's fingers tightened around the phone. Every instinct told her to slip it back and pretend she had seen nothing. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. But the message in her hand, the hidden weapon, the signals, Damian's sudden stillness, all of it came together in one awful realization. The room was seconds away from disaster, and if she stayed quiet, people were going to die. The thought hit her like a punch. Emma glanced once more at Damian Blackwood, the man who ruled this room without raising his voice, and understood with sick certainty that whatever came next would change everything. She had just found herself in the middle of a betrayal, and the first move had already been made. Emma's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The message on her phone seemed to glow in her hand like a warning she could not afford to ignore. 4 digits. A symbol. Nothing else. No explanation, no name, no mercy. She stared at it for a second too long, and when she looked up again, the man with the concealed weapon had shifted in his seat. Not much, just enough to let her know he was waiting to see what she would do next. The room still looked polished and elegant from a distance, but Emma could no longer see it that way. The crystal glasses, the soft golden lights, the expensive suits, the quiet music in the background. All of it now felt fake, like a beautiful mask stretched over something rotten. She had spent her whole life learning how to survive by staying small, by not causing trouble, by keeping her head down and doing her job. But this was no longer about a spilled drink or a rude customer. This was about a room full of powerful men, one of whom was about to be betrayed in a way that could end in blood. Emma swallowed hard and slipped the phone back into her apron pocket. Her hands were colder than ice, but she forced herself to keep moving. Panic would only make her obvious, and being obvious was dangerous. She passed behind a pair of guests laughing too loudly over expensive whiskey, then paused near the center pillar where she could see the entire table without drawing attention. Damian Blackwood sat like a carved statue, still and unreadable, but she noticed that one of his fingers had begun tapping once against the table. Slow, measured, controlled. Not fear exactly. Readiness. That detail made her chest tighten. He knew. He might not know who, or how, or when, but he knew something was about to happen. And if he knew, then why wasn't he stopping it? Why hadn't he already given the order for the room to be cleared? Unless he was waiting for the betrayal to reveal itself. Unless he needed proof. Or maybe he was hoping to catch the traitor in the act. Emma's thoughts spun, but before she could make sense of them, the waiter beside the doorway reached for a tray and accidentally dropped a fork. The sound rang out louder than it should have in the tense silence. Heads turned. A few guests frowned. Damian looked up. For half a second, the entire room froze. Emma saw it then. A flicker of movement near the far corner, a man adjusting his jacket, another sliding a hand beneath the tablecloth, and the gray-haired guest's expression sharpening with cold impatience. Everything in her screamed that this was the moment before the strike. A gun could come out. A knife. A signal. Something far worse. She didn't know which. She only knew that if no one acted now, this elegant room would become a massacre. Her breathing turned shallow. She should have stayed silent. She should have kept her distance. But the fear rising inside her was no longer for herself. It was for the people sitting around that table, for the servers moving through the room, for the terrible speed at which one wrong move could turn champagne and candlelight into chaos. Then Damian's gaze shifted, cutting directly toward her. Emma's blood went cold. It was not an accident. He had noticed her, really noticed her, and somehow, in the middle of all this danger, that was almost more terrifying than the threat itself. Because now she could feel it. Her life had crossed into a line she could never uncross. The room was about to explode, and Damian Blackwood had just looked at her as if he expected her to know exactly why. Damian's stare pinned Emma in place for one impossible second, as if he had reached across the room and seized her by the wrist without ever touching her. The noise in the dining room seemed to vanish around that single look. No laughter, no clinking glass, no music, only the hard silence between them, full of danger and unspoken questions. Emma's chest tightened so sharply she thought she might stop breathing altogether. She had no idea what Damian saw when he looked at her, but whatever it was, it made him turn his head slightly, just enough to watch the men around his table without breaking eye contact with the room. That was when everything began to move. The gray-haired man rose from his chair with deliberate calm, lifting his glass as if to toast. At the same time, two security guards near the entrance shifted their weight in perfect unison. The waiter who had dropped the fork straightened too quickly. Another guest reached for his jacket. Emma's skin went cold. Her instincts screamed that the next few seconds would decide whether everyone in the room walked out alive. She didn't know the exact plan, but she knew enough to understand that the betrayal was no longer hidden. It was alive now, breathing. Someone shouted from the far end of the table. A chair scraped across the floor. Then a flash of metal cut through the dim light. Emma ducked on instinct, her body moving before her mind could catch up. A scream ripped through the room. Glass shattered. One of the side lamps toppled over and burst into sparks against the floor. Damian was already standing, his chair knocked back behind him, one hand reaching into his jacket with terrifying speed. The room erupted into panic. Men shouted over one another. Security guards moved toward the exits. Someone near the windows fired a shot into the ceiling. The thunder of it slammed through Emma's body and made her ears ring. This was not a threat anymore. It was the collapse she had feared. Emma crouched low behind the dessert cart, heart hammering so violently it hurt. Through the chaos, she saw the gray-haired man step backward, not surprised, not afraid, almost relieved. That sickened her more than the gunfire. This had all been planned to end in blood. Damien turned sharply, barking orders in a voice so cold and controlled it cut through the panic like a blade. Two men rushed toward him, and for one terrifying moment Emma thought they were his enemies. Then she saw the flash of an earpiece and realized they were his people. Still, the room had already turned into a battlefield. Another shot rang out, this one closer. Emma flinched so hard she nearly lost her balance, her fingers digging into the edge of the cart. People were screaming now, pushing toward the doors, tripping over chairs, crashing into each other in a blind rush to escape. The elegant dinner had become chaos in less than a minute. And through all of it, Damien Blackwood remained visible, a dark figure cutting through the smoke and noise with the same terrifying authority he had carried in silence. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and when they steadied again, Emma saw something that made her stomach drop even further. The gray-haired man was gone. He had vanished into the confusion, and with him went the answer to who had set the trap. The empire had just been shaken to its core, and Emma knew with absolute certainty that the worst part was still coming. The room was still unraveling when Emma made the choice that would change everything. She should have stayed hidden behind the dessert cart until security cleared the floor. She should have waited for the chaos to pass, slipped out the service door, and spent the rest of the night pretending she had never been there at all. That would have been the safest path, the smartest one. But safety had already become a lie the moment the first gun was drawn. Now all she could think about was the missing man, the signal on her phone, and the awful certainty that the attack had not been random. It had been carefully prepared, which meant there was still a second layer to this. Something worse waiting under the panic. Emma rose slowly, keeping her head low as she moved along the side of the room. Tables had been overturned. A wine bottle had exploded across the floor in a dark red spill. One of the chandeliers had begun to sway overhead, casting broken shadows against the wall. Men shouted orders, but no one seemed to know who was in control anymore. Damien was somewhere near the center of the room, still fighting to hold the situation together, his voice cutting through the noise with brutal authority. Yet Emma no longer felt small in his presence. Not now. Not after what she had seen. She spotted a security guard crouched near the service corridor, speaking into an earpiece with a face gone pale. He was repeating the same phrase over and over. The ledger is missing. Emma stopped mid-step. The ledger. She didn't know what it contained, but she knew from the guard's tone that it mattered more than money, more than pride, more than the mess on the floor. The attack had not just been meant to kill. It had been meant to steal something. Her eyes flicked back toward the table where the gray-haired man had sat, and in that moment the pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. The napkin, the hidden weapon, the signals, the way he had looked at her after realizing she had seen too much. He had not only been part of the ambush, he had been there to remove whatever was sitting inside Damien's private files. Emma's breath caught. If that ledger existed, then the betrayal ran far deeper than this one room. It meant someone inside Damien's empire was feeding information out from the inside. It meant the attack was only the visible part of a much larger corruption. And if she stayed silent, the people behind it would disappear before anyone could connect the pieces. Without thinking any further, Emma crossed toward Damien. Every instinct told her this was insane. He was still surrounded by armed men, still trying to restore order, still the most dangerous person in the room, even while under threat. But he was also the only one who could act on what she knew. She reached the edge of the chaos and raised her voice just enough to cut through the shouting. "The man in the gray suit," she said. "He didn't come here to kill you. He came for something else." Damien turned sharply toward her. For one suspended second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes locked on hers with a force that made it impossible to look away. Emma swallowed and held on to her fear, because she had already stepped too far to retreat now. "He left something behind," she added. "If you don't find it fast, whoever planned this is going to finish what they started." And in that instant, Emma Carter, just a waitress to everyone else in the room, became the only person brave enough to speak the truth. Damien did not answer her right away. For one long, unbearable second, he only stared at Emma as if weighing whether she was a threat, a witness, or something far more dangerous. Around them, the room still trembled with the aftershock of violence. Security shouting into radios, guests stumbling toward the exits, broken glass crunching under frantic feet. But Emma barely heard any of it now. The silence between her and Damien felt heavier than the gunfire that had just torn through the dinner. Then he moved, not toward the exits, not toward the wounded, toward her. The men nearest to him stepped aside instantly, as if they had been trained all their lives to make room for that kind of authority. Damien stopped in front of Emma, so close she could see the controlled fury in his eyes, the sharpness in his jaw, the way his hand remained hidden inside his jacket as though he expected another attack at any second. He looked like a man carved out of ice and pressure, someone who had built an empire by never giving the world the satisfaction of seeing him panic. But there was something else there now too. Something new. Suspicion, yes, but also a raw, reluctant attention. "What did you see?" he asked. His voice was low, steady, and impossible to ignore. Emma swallowed. Her mouth had gone dry, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "A setup." The gray-haired man passed the signal. The weapon was concealed, but the attack wasn't the main goal. They were after something. Damien's gaze sharpened. What thing? Emma hesitated just long enough to feel the weight of every eye in the room, even though most people were still too busy running to listen. "A ledger," she said. "I heard one of your security men mention it before everything collapsed." That single word changed Damien's expression. It was small, barely visible, but Emma caught it. A tightening around the eyes. A hardening of the jaw. Confirmation. So she had been right. Damien turned without another word and barked an order to the nearest men. "Lock the building. No one leaves. Search every exit, every corridor, every trash chute. Find a gray suit." The force in his voice snapped through the room like a whip. His men moved immediately, their panic replaced by sharp, disciplined urgency. Emma stood frozen, suddenly aware of how exposed she was in the center of all that power. She had said the truth, but truth did not always make people safe. Sometimes it made them the next target. Damien looked back at her. This time, his eyes were different. He was no longer looking at her like a waitress who happened to know something. He was looking at her like a piece on a board he had just realized he could not afford to lose. "Why tell me?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. Emma almost laughed at how impossible it was to answer simply. Why tell him? Because if she stayed silent, people would die. Because she had seen too much. Because fear had finally lost a conscience. Because something in her refused to let a room full of people be slaughtered while she pretended she had not understood the danger. Instead, she said the truth in its simplest form. Because you were going to be betrayed. The answer hung between them. Damien studied her for another long moment, and Emma could feel the shift happening in real time. The dismissal she had expected never came. No insult. No order to get out. No cold reminder of her place. Instead, he gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but heavy with meaning. Then he said, "You're coming with me." Emma's breath caught. Not as a servant. Not as a witness to be discarded. As someone he needed. And in the shattered remains of the dining room, while his empire searched for the traitor hidden inside it, Damien Blackwood had just chosen the one person everyone else had ignored. Emma had expected anger, suspicion, maybe even punishment. What she had not expected was the silence that followed Damien's. Order, not the absence of sound. The room was still full of radios crackling, doors slamming, and security men shouting over each other, but the deeper kind of silence that came from realization. Something had gone terribly wrong inside Damien Blackwood's world, and everyone in it now knew that the waitress they had ignored might be the only reason they were still alive. Damien led her away from the wrecked dining room and into a private corridor lined with dark wood and soft lights that suddenly felt too calm after the chaos behind them. He walked fast, and Emma had to keep up, her heart still racing, her hands still cold from the shock of what had happened. She kept waiting for him to tell her she had overstepped, that she had spoken too freely, that she had no right to follow him into the center of something so dangerous. But he said nothing. He only opened a side door and brought her into a secure room where two of his men were already searching stacks of documents spread across a long table. The ledger was there, or what was left of it. Its pages had been ripped apart and scattered, but not before Damien's men had started piecing together what it had contained. Names, dates, payment routes. enough to expose a leak from within his organization. Emma stood quietly near the door as Damien read through the recovered pages, his expression growing harder with each line. Every few seconds, he looked up at the evidence, then back at her, as if he was now seeing the night through her eyes. The betrayal had not just been a failed attack. It had been an inside operation. Someone close to him had handed over access, timing, and knowledge of the ledger's location. If the note she had seen earlier had been the bait, this paper trail was the blade. One of the men swore under his breath when he found a repeated signature in the records. Damien's gaze snapped to it. Emma could feel the temperature in the room drop as he traced the name with one finger. The traitor was not a stranger. He was one of Damien's trusted lieutenants, a man who had sat at his table more than once. The realization hit like a second explosion, quieter than the gunfire, but far more devastating. An enemy. Outside the Empire was dangerous. An enemy inside it was poison. Emma's stomach twisted as she watched Damien absorb the truth. He did not lash out. He did not curse. He simply stood there, motionless, as if every line of his face had turned to stone. It was the expression of a man who had just discovered that the foundation beneath him had been rotting for months. Then, slowly, he folded the damaged ledger and set it on the table as if placing a weapon down. "You were right," he said. The words were quiet, but they landed harder than any shout. Emma blinked, not quite sure how to respond. She had not been looking for praise. She had only wanted to stop the bloodshed. But the look he gave her now was no longer guarded or dismissive. It was sharp with respect, and underneath that, something else she did not have the courage to name yet. "You saved my empire tonight," Damien said, his voice lower now, roughened by something almost like disbelief. Emma's throat tightened. For the first time since she had stepped into that room, the weight of what she had done reached her all at once. She had not just noticed a threat. She had uncovered a betrayal that could have destroyed everything Damien owned. And in doing so, she had crossed from being invisible to being unforgettable. Damien's eyes stayed on hers. Then, with a calm that felt almost more dangerous than anger, he said, "From now on, no one touches you without my permission." Emma could only stare at him, because in that moment, it became clear that the Empire had been saved, but her life had just begun to change in ways she could never have predicted. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. "From now on, no one touches you without my permission." Emma had heard powerful men make promises before. She had seen them smile while lying, flatter while calculating, and speak of protection as if it were a gift instead of a chain. But there was nothing casual in Damien Blackwood's voice now. No performance, no charm, only control and the unmistakable weight of a decision that had already been made. It should have frightened her. In some ways, it did. Yet beneath the fear was something stranger, an awareness that the world around her had shifted permanently, and there was no returning to the version of herself who had entered that dining room as just another waitress. The aftermath of the attack stretched deep into the night. Men moved in and out of the secure room with clipped voices and urgent footsteps, carrying broken files, cracked phones, and the names of people Emma would never meet but would now hear mentioned in whispers. Damien stood at the center of it all, issuing orders with the same terrifying calm he had shown before the room descended into chaos. But now, every so often, his attention drifted back to her, not as a distraction, not as an accessory, as if he needed to confirm she was still there. Emma tried to stay small near the edge of the room, though for the first time in her life, smallness no longer felt like safety. It felt like an old habit she was being forced to outgrow. One of Damien's men brought in a fresh stack of reports, and Emma caught fragments of the conversation: financial routes, names of informants, hidden accounts, a scheduled transfer that had nearly allowed the traitor to disappear. Every detail confirmed how close the Empire had come to collapse. If she had dismissed the note, if she had ignored the hidden weapon, if she had stayed silent when she realized what was happening, the entire structure might have fallen before dawn. Damien returned to the table and stopped beside her. For the first time since meeting him, he did not look like a man behind a wall of ice. He looked tired, dangerous still, but tired in the way only leaders become after they discover the damage was growing under their feet all along. He studied Emma for a moment, and she had the strange feeling that he was seeing not the waitress in front of him, but the path she had taken to get here. Every overlooked detail, every instinct, every choice that had led to this exact moment. You knew something was wrong before anyone else, he said. Emma gave a small, uncertain nod. No one else would have noticed, he continued, his eyes narrowing slightly with something like respect. And no one else would have spoken. She looked down for half a second, then back at him. I didn't do it for praise. His mouth moved very slightly, almost a smile, but not quite. I know. Outside the room, the empire was already changing shape. The traitor had not escaped. The ledger had exposed more than one name. By morning, people would be arrested, alliances would collapse, and enemies would start running. But inside that broken night, the real change had already happened. Damian Blackwood had gone from treating Emma Carter like background noise to treating her like someone whose presence altered the entire board. And Emma, standing under the dim lights with blood still drying somewhere beyond the wall, realized the truth she had been too stunned to say aloud. She had not only saved a mafia boss's empire, she had stepped into his world and survived it. Damian held her gaze one last time before giving the quiet order that sealed her fate. Stay close. 2 small words. No explanation. No softness. But for Emma, they were enough to understand that this was no longer the end of a disaster. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous.